Next panel, this is our life perspectives from directly affected individuals, will be moderated by Cori Chertoff, a consultant for the Alternative Sentencing Division for the Aleph Institute. Cori has extensive experience in group facilitating. She's trained in psychotherapy, restorative justice, mediation, and conflict resolution. Cori has created several transformative programs which are implemented in New York State prisons where she facilitates these groups. Cori is a consultant for Aleph and trains the Aleph staff in the Alternative Sentencing Division who represent clients after their arrest. She works nationally in private practice. Right after this session, we will quickly, it's pretty cool, I'm giving instructions to judges and prosecutors. It's probably a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So we will quickly grab our lunches, and please come right back here. I urge you to bring the lunch inside, because we're going to have a very special, intimate discussion of racial bias in our system between the Honorable Judge Donald and Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, Professor of Psychology, Stanford University, and co-director of SPARC. And finally, one last thing, Cori, with 10 minutes left, I'm going to stop the panel discussion and open up the floor for questions for everybody. Okay? Shoshana will let you know when there's 10 minutes left. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Can you guys see us over there? I guess you're looking at the screen. Early in my career, very early in my career, I worked with children whose parents were incarcerated, and that really gave me a lens into the damage, the collateral damage when a parent is sentenced to prison. In that safe space, children and teens were able to really express their innermost feelings, their feelings of despair, of abandonment, of shame, of depression and hopelessness, and it totally transformed my way of thinking and looking at my own career. I began to work inside of prisons with men who were incarcerated and women who were incarcerated, and began to realize that so many of them were on a trajectory because of drug abuse, trauma, childhood abuse, domestic violence, and all kinds of life experiences that required treatment and a therapeutic intervention, not prison, and none of them seemed to be getting help at all. And I saw the families completely fractured. So early on, I understood the damage that is caused by incarceration and began to wonder about creative alternatives. And I decided to become a mitigation specialist because I wanted to be able to work with people to understand their stories and to help them tell their own stories, and particularly to a judge who was about to make a big decision, a life decision that impacted not only them, but their entire family. And I am honored today to be here with 4 panelists who are going to share their story with you. I just want to say a word about my experience with Aleph, because when I was introduced to the Aleph Institute and understood that they were creating an alternative sentencing division, I was very excited about it and understood that the Aleph paradigm is to really get to know the individual and their family members and to give them the kind of support that they weren't receiving at all after arrest. Individuals were terrified, and the most important part of this paradigm is that when people felt cared for and felt that they were in a safe space, they shifted from feeling like a victim of the system to being able to actually take responsibility for their wrongdoing, to look back to see what led to their poor choices and their actions, and to be able to really feel remorse and express it, and be on a healing journey at that point with the support of the Aleph services. And it was very enlightening to me. I'm still a part of it and very honored to be. So I'd like to introduce our panelists who are here in a very generous, courageous environment, because some of them have never spoken in public before about their personal stories. So I am completely grateful to all of you. Okay. Heidi is here to share her story about her husband's arrest and the impact it had on her 3 children and herself. And I'm going to open it up and let her really tell you her story. Michelle's father is incarcerated, and he was her primary support system at the time, and she will be sharing with you about her personal journey. Topeka Sam is somebody who was incarcerated and came out of prison with a vengeance to take care of what she saw injustice in the system and to help women and girls who needed to find a grounding and needed to have support. And she has taken that mission everywhere, and you'll learn about that. Her bio is in the program, so feel free to take a look at that. Matthew Charles is going to share his story about being sentenced under the mandatory minimums for drug offenses, and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison and looking at what felt like a lifetime. And after 2 decades of being a model inmate, of turning to his religion and being an incredible mentor to others in the prison system, he was, after 2 decades, released, only to find 2 years later, after living a law-abiding, productive life, the prosecutors going after him and returning him back to prison. Ultimately, he was the first person actually released under the First Step Act, and we are very honored to have the 4 of you here today. Thank you so much. So Heidi, let's start with you.
Just checking that it's working. Working? When I was first invited to attend the summit, I readily accepted. After all, it'll be 4 years on July 9th, 2019. I wish I could say that time heals all wounds. While the wounds penetrate less, it doesn't mean there aren't triggers to bring me back into the black hole. I didn't expect such feelings of anxiety, flashbacks, and fear to return with a vengeance. Reliving these painful emotions has been very exhausting. I foolishly thought I put them to rest. As I humbly sit today before you as a woman with strength and resilience, I remember vividly the feelings of shame, humiliation, horror, and disbelief. While I wasn't responsible for the actions that led to these feelings, it didn't lessen or ease my despair. How could the man as I knew him be in a mugshot plastered all over our community newspapers? A community where the most action the police would ever have is a traffic violation. I even called the mayor, who I knew from high school, pleading with her to call the local newspaper to remove the story. She said she could not. My grocery shopping was done by driving 30 minutes away so I wouldn't see anyone. I dragged myself out of bed each day to get my kids off to school. After they left, I would lay on my couch until the end of the day, staring at the ceiling and the walls. I worried how Tali was handling walking the halls of the high school. Would there be snickers and gossip? David, only 12 years old, had his bar mitzvah coming up. Should we cancel it? How could he find the strength to read Torah without his father next to him? Ari left for his first year of college with all of this chaos and trauma. I felt like I had to put on a mask that communicated moving forward and that it would all be okay. Was it going to be okay? Was this going to be my life now? I remember the feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. How were we ever going to survive such devastation emotionally, financially, and even socially? Tony was a loving man, full of life, love, and light. He would walk into a room and make you feel like he was happy to see you and genuinely interested in everything you had to say. He was a loving and nurturing father involved in the 3 lives of our children. He was a valued son-in-law, brother-in-law, and uncle. His entire nuclear family worshiped the ground he walked on and always turned to him in times of need. He would give the shirt off his back to a friend and even a stranger. An outwardly joyful man, no one could see the scars and the wounds he carried. He was tortured at times by his own demons. He had night terrors in which he screamed and raced around the house, hyperventilating, unaware of his surroundings. He experienced panic attacks that were without specific triggers. As a social worker, I knew the source of his ghosts. As a soldier and a medic in the Israeli army, he witnessed traumatic events that were deeply embedded in his soul. Over the years, he would brush off my attempts to talk about these and refuse to go to therapy. After his mandatory service, the Army discharged him with a Profile 21, which is a medical code used by the military of Israel to classify Israelis who are deemed to have physical or psychological disabilities, making them permanently unfit for military services. A car accident that left him with horrible headaches and mounting financial pressures was the beginning of Tony's outward demise. A man who was so protective of his family now had shady business associates that were the antithesis of everything I had known and respected. How does a good man commit such crimes as these? To this day, it is difficult to integrate the loving husband and father with the man known to the court system. My husband's attorney felt that in order to fight his case, he would need a psychological evaluation explaining mitigating factors. His attorney felt that Tony was, quote, worth saving, unquote. Maybe the judge would have compassion and there would be leniency in sentencing. Many sleepless nights and long days were spent digging for resources. While I couldn't argue with the crimes Tony had committed, I was committed to the father of my children so that my children wouldn't completely lose Tony. I had never in my life felt so alone and terrified for our family. It was one sleepless night I felt the Aleph Institute on the internet. Their support on every level has been my lifeline. I sent a plea for help with pictures of our family. They responded by helping my husband be evaluated by a neuropsychologist. Her report showed that there were mitigating factors to explain his criminal behavior. Her report showed that there were post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, panic disorders, and substance abuse were documented. The Aleph Institute prepared documents for sentencing on his behalf. I couldn't help being afraid since Tony's attorney said this was a very, very tough judge. I will never forget that day in court. I felt like I was going to throw up and faint. I must have stopped the circulation in my sister's hand, squeezing it so tight. I thought I would break it. Judge Graham's response was almost shocking. He remarked on the neurological support in the sentencing document prepared by Aleph. He commented that he had never seen something so comprehensive. My husband gave a very tearful, emotional, and heartfelt apology to the court. It was very moving. The judge remarked on the mental health issues and sentenced him to below the sentencing guidelines. The attorney recommended to Judge Graham that Tony be sent to a specific federal prison that had programs for persons with comorbid mental health and substance abuse issues. The judge agreed. That never happened. He was sent to a prison and his mental health needs were ignored and neglected. In 42 months, his mental health conditions further deteriorated. Many times I called Aleph in distress for them to call the prison on his behalf. Just 2 weeks ago, Tony finished his federal sentence and was released to ICE custody. He will be deported to his homeland, a very, very sick man. He has lost everything. My children will lose their father again. Rebuilding relationships with his children will be difficult. He doesn't have the emotional capacity to be a parent in spite of trying so hard. I came here today because I want my voice and my story to be heard. I want what our family had to endure to be remembered when distinguished guests at the summit have the power and choice to make a difference. If there is a recommendation to be at a prison with certain programming to help rehabilitate the prisoner, why is this disregarded? When you send someone to prison who is mentally ill, how can they get better? How can they do better in their lives when they are released? Tony wasn't the only one who went to prison. We all went to prison too. All human beings should have the opportunity to become the best versions of themselves. Tony went to a prison, a facility that failed him. Yes, he failed on many veins, but his prison sentence was specific to allay his mental incapacities, so when he was released, he could do so with an inkling of a chance to do better on the outside. Families of inmates are forgotten victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. I know that wasn't easy, and everybody here feels a deep, deep gratitude to you. Michelle?
My name is Michelle. I'm 17 years old, and my dad was sentenced to 72 months in prison. It was his first offense. My life fell into pieces when the FBI came pounding on our door at 5 in the morning on what was supposed to be a typical Tuesday. I opened the door to see armed men standing in front of me, asking for my dad. I immediately went into shock. Every single imaginable thought went racing through my mind, but the most prominent one was, what am I supposed to do? As they were handcuffing him, I yelled, he didn't do anything. Please, I have nobody else. Please don't take him from me. My dad promised me he'd be home soon, that I'd see him that night. I ended up never seeing him again after that morning. I lost my mom when I was 13 years old to a stroke and 2 different cancers. My dad had been with me through it all, through all the years of her struggles, and in turn all the years that I struggled. He never hesitated to come to my side, to hug me, to talk to me, take me to get ice cream, do all the little things that seem unimportant at the time, but count the most. Essentially, he was my rock, my home. Now it feels as though this home was taken from me, as if I'm bare and homeless. I now am forced to struggle alone, although I do have friends and a supportive brother, but they don't understand what it's like. This deep, never-ending feeling of loneliness and torment. He's been by my side since I could remember, taking me to my doctor's appointments, helping me out with my homework, dragging me to participate in extracurricular activities. My dad is an incredible human being with a giant warm heart, who made a mistake, as many others have before in their life. Not being able to have him daily in my life, seeing as though he only has a limited amount of minutes to speak and a limited amount of visits a month, has been devastating. I've lost my sense of self without him. My self-confidence has suffered, as the loss of parents make me feel as less of a person, in a way, as if I don't deserve the same opportunities as everyone else. I find myself apologizing for everything and never taking risks and having a negative outlook on life, since it feels as though everything I obtain gets taken from me. I've become restless, not being able to sleep most nights. Yet I can't let my schoolwork suffer since it's one of the only things in life I do control. In essence, without my dad, my life has become a cycle of stress and misery that I have to deal with on my own. I'm at a point in my life where I need guidance the most, guidance from the only parent I have left. Yet I'm alone. Alone for college applications, alone for prom, alone for graduation. And most importantly, I feel like I'm alone in my life.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing. Topeka.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, first, thank you, Heidi and Michelle, for sharing your experience, and it really, it's impacted me, so your voice is definitely necessary in this space. Yeah, I was talking to them, sorry. I'll project. And that this reminds me of my family and the stresses that was put through to them, so thank you for sharing. Okay, can you hear me now? All right. So a little bit about myself. I'm from New York, born and raised in Long Island in Manorville. Come from a two-parent home. My parents were franchise business owners and restaurateurs. We grew up in an area where we were the only black family in our neighborhood. My parents built our house from the ground up. They wanted to show us that as people of color that we can have anything with hard work, but also they wanted to take us out of where they were raised, which was the Bronx and Harlem. And so throughout life, growing up, always was told that I could do anything that I wanted to do, but also the fact that I was a black woman or young girl at the time, that I had to be 110% better than my friends who I grew up with. And so that I was always very ambitious and driven, whether I was the president of every club, including the Spanish club, and didn't speak Spanish, or I was captain of every sports team, I played piano, classically trained, and given all the opportunities in the world, and I was told I was going to college. And so though I could have went to any college that I wanted to, I ended up choosing an HBCU, historically black college, because I wanted to be around other kids that looked like me. So I went to Baltimore, Maryland, to Morgan State University, and when I got there, it was beautiful because I was around people that looked like me. But yet, it was also a new experience for me because everything was different. I was told that I talked white, or I was pretty to be dark-skinned, and I remember calling my mom and asking her, like, what's going on, because I didn't really understand it. And then she just started to explain just the diversity and the differences that happen within people of color. And then I began to try to find a sense of connectedness and belonging, and so I started going off campus and hanging in the street or hanging with people who were from Baltimore City and dating guys who sold drugs, and eventually I thought I could sell drugs, and I did. And so while going to school and starting businesses, and this was just like a cycle that went on for many years, I ended up being arrested, and eventually I was given federal supervision as my sentence because it was my first time, and I completed early. 1 year, my judge told me to come back after 18 months and file for early termination of sentence, and I did. And at that point, I said, all right, I'm not doing anything, that's it, it's done, you know, I got a second chance. And so about maybe a few years later, I get a phone call from my past, and I was in the process of opening another business. I was division chairperson for Amtrak for New York and DC. And I was like, okay, I can connect some people together, make quick money, and be done with it. And it was a federal drug sting operation. And so I found myself arrested in a county jail in Virginia. And so while I was there, I thought, like any other time, I would just go to court and I would get a bail. And so our family's there, friends there, we have property, whatever needs to be put up, we're gonna put up so I can get out and fight my case. But I was told by the judge that I was a drug queenpin and a danger to society, and I was given no bail. And so I sat, and at that point, I realized that I needed to really begin to find out what was happening within this new community that I was a part of. And I began going to AA and NA classes because I personally didn't do drugs, but I wanted to know why people took drugs because I thought it was a personal choice. And I began to ask the women, and they would tell me, one woman specifically that I speak about always told me that her father was raping her, and he gave her heroin and told her to take it, and the pain would go away. And I would see women cycling in and out, and sometimes never come back because we would find out that they had overdosed and died. And so throughout that time, I was like, well, this is jurisdictional entrapment, and there were no drugs. It was a conspiracy charge. I shouldn't have to go to jail. But through really understanding at that point the impacts that even some of the decisions that I had made in my life had impacted women specifically and then families, I pled guilty. And I ended up going to federal prison. And though in federal prison, I still felt very privileged because my parents came, my brothers came, my friends came, whether I was in Virginia, Connecticut, or Illinois. But I also knew that many of the women that were with me were not, and that when they were coming home, that they wouldn't have a second opportunity, that a lot of times they would be sitting there in fear because they didn't know where they would go, or they would go back to an abusive relationship, end up in a shelter, didn't know where their children were, or many of them had been trapped in the system after decades because of conspiracy charges, and most of their family had passed away. And so reconnecting with God, God gave me the vision to start my organization, the Ladies of Hope Ministries. I met my partner, Vinay Sykes, who's the co-founder of Hope House. Different from the last Hope House you heard, but in New York, in the Bronx. And it's a co-living space for women who are coming home from prison or jail. We also do alternatives to incarceration. So opposed to us actually bailing people out, we tell the judges, hey, there's a safe place for the sister to come that's ran and of by other women who've been impacted by incarceration. So we ask them to release them on their own recognizances, and they do. And we've been successful with having women come there, making sure that we connect them back to resources, whether it's through educational opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities and training, and then eventually, after a year, most of them stay, then we get them into affordable housing and now into home ownership. Through my experience also, though I'm a firm believer that there needs to be alternatives to incarceration and that we should not be putting women and girls in jail, I feel that there's a lot of trauma that people have gone through, specifically women, sexual trauma, violence, and abuse, and that leads them onto a trajectory that then lands them in prison. And if we pour into people and give them opportunities, give them healing, and give them other resources, that what I find that it changes the lives and the pathways of people, specifically women and girls. And so through the work that I do, I also work with Cut 50 as the Director for Dignity for Incarcerated Women, where we change the conditions of confinement for women that are incarcerated. So we passed, to date, 16 pieces of legislation nationally on the conditions of confinement, making sure women are no longer shackled during child labor or put into solitary confinement just because they're pregnant. Making sure women have personal hygiene products like pads and tampons, which is ridiculous that we have to write legislation for that, but we do. Making sure that families are connected and not sent hundreds of miles away, because yes, the judges do say that they should get resources, but unfortunately it doesn't extend to the person who's incarcerated. And also in New York as a senior advisor to New Yorkers United for Justice, I work at making sure that we are passing comprehensive packages around criminal justice reform here in New York City, since it is my home. And though I appreciate doing the work with many people, specifically women who have been incarcerated and impacted by incarceration nationally, that in my home in New York, we have one of the worst criminal justice systems anywhere. And we are far behind in legislation. And so really focusing in the next year on making sure that we're doing more reform outside of the bail and discovery reform that we were just able to do, that we're doing reform as it relates to housing reform, parole reform, and executive clemency power. And so I guess I would just end before passing to my brother here, that in a room like this, I'm grateful to Aleph Institute to bring the state actors together, federal prosecutors and judges together in a room who care and who want to see, I guess, alternatives to what can happen, but also that, you know, when I think about the laws and things that are imposed, and I understand that, you know, when you sentence people, sometimes that's just the end of it, that there are families that are impacted, there's lives that are impacted, and we really need to start looking at some of the sentencing and especially around, for me, being a person who's in federal prison, conspiracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Topeka. It's enlightening to hear that certainly you're helping women transition coming out of prison, but also the possibility of offering a safe space for women who are being granted an alternative sentence in the courtroom. So thank you so much. Good for you. Matthew.
My name is Matthew Charles. Before I start, I just want to say that I definitely take accountability for my own actions. So even as I tell my story, sometimes it's emotional. Okay. I said, I want to start off by saying I take accountability for my own actions, even though as I tell my story, some of the things that I endured will allow you to see why my life ended up the way that it was. I was born in a household of 6 siblings. We were very poor. My father was very, very abusive, physically and verbally, to us as well as my mother. From the earliest time of me actually having any recollection that I actually recognized people, at the age of 3 or 4, it was seeing my mother with, you know, 2 blackened eyes and being chased around the house. And but as I stated, I take accountability for my own actions because it was my decisions that actually rendered me in prison years later. But because of that, I actually graduated from high school, and the respectful way to get out of that household, because as I stated, my father was abusive, not only to my mother, but all of us as siblings. I think only 2 of my sisters, my youngest, my oldest, were spared the abuse. Why, I don't know. They were favored. But once I graduated high school, I went into the military. And even though it wasn't physical abuse, it was a misuse of abuse, I thought, because I didn't have a proper understanding of leadership or people that are in power. So therefore, once I finished my 3 years service, I ended up getting out of the service, and from that point on, my life just down spiraled. I made every bad decision that you can possibly imagine. And in 1995, I was arrested for drug charges and drug-related offenses, and I was given a 35-year sentence because of that offense. But before then, I got arrested in December of 1995. And while in the county jail, I ended up meeting somebody who I considered a friend, because in jail, you just cling on and have conversation with whoever it is that you can. And when he was leaving, after he had already been sentenced because he had been at the jail before me, he ended up leaving me a brown King James Gideon Bible, along with some toothpaste and some other hygiene products, things of that nature. So I took all of it as a friend would do. I didn't know that I would actually be reading that Bible and literally give my life unto God shortly thereafter. But I took it from him, then he left, and afterwards I started reading the Bible. Then shortly thereafter, I surrendered my life and heart over to the Lord Jesus Christ. And from that point on, that was February of 1996. I got arrested in December 1995. Prior to December 1995, I didn't even believe in God, because he never showed up in my household to help my mother or us. So therefore, I didn't even believe that God existed. I thought he was a crutch. But here it is in February 1996, he's showing me that he is real and that I need him. And in my acceptance of him, I came to understand why my father did what he did. There's no justification for what he did, but I understand why he did what he did and why I lived the life that I had lived. So I was actually sentenced in December of 1996 after I gave my life to the Lord in February of 1996 to a 35-year sentence. As Cori has stated, at the time the guidelines were mandatory. And for my base offense level and the drug quantity I had, I was looking at 30 years to life. So the judge sentenced me to 35 years. The prosecution was asking for life, and was very dissatisfied when the judge gave me 35 years instead. So therefore, I'm looking at it, and they actually stated in months, because they don't say years in federal prison. So when they said 420 months, I look at my attorney, he looked at me, And I'm like, calculate this. And because I didn't understand what it was, and he was like 35 years, and I was like, whoa. Because, you know, when you hear that and the judge gives you that sentence, 420 months, sometimes, even though you're wishing it would have been 420 days, it sounds like 420 days, but I know that it wasn't. But it was 420 months, and it was 35 years, so I was like, wow. But I had my soul anchored because I had become a Christian, and it was like 7 months period between then. I had been learning more about my Christian faith, so I was very, very heartbroken that I received such a sentence, but I also knew that I wasn't finna get a slap on the wrist or a pat on the back for my actions. So once I entered into federal prison, I did so as a Christian. And at the time, as we all know, the First Step Act just passed the latter part of last year and being implemented this year. So there was really no incentives for rehabilitation. But because I was a different person, I was trying to learn more about my Christian faith and what was required of me, I took advantage of every opportunity that I could, and therefore I took a bunch of educational courses, college courses, vocational courses, just to better myself. And in the process of it, I was able to help those that were around me, the inmates. I worked as an educational tutor and helped several, if not hundreds, of people receive their GEDs. God actually blessed me with that and gave me favor to be able to relate to them on whatever level they was and bring them up to speed. I also worked in the law library for close to 8 years, and I was able to see about my own situation and other people's cases and help read their letters from their attorneys, as well as the letters that they were writing and receiving, and the letters probably that some of you as judges sent them about their case and their final dispositions of it. But anyway, I was able to assist them, and I was just doing whatever I could, always praying and being hopeful that things would change so that I would, as Topeka stated, have my second chance or another chance. And in 2010, the federal sentencing guidelines were changed to remove the racial disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And in doing so, it allowed me to be able to file for a reduction of sentence. And I filed for a reduction of sentence, and federal judge Kevin Sharp actually reduced my sentence. And in reducing my sentence in 2016, it allowed me to be able to be released. Now, the government appealed my release at that time, and throughout that whole period of me being set free, they continued to file petitions ordering or asking for the court to send me back. So I was out for nearly 2 years at that time. I had a job, I had purchased a truck, I was volunteering my time, I actually had a church home, and I had a place to stay. So I was doing everything that you would want a productive member of society to do. So therefore, once the Court of Appeals agreed with them that I should be sent back because the judge didn't have the authority to reduce my sentence because the changes were not made retroactive. That's the reason that it's real important that a lot of these changes that actually right the wrongs of those who have been done wrong, whether it's racially or because of their impoverished, that those changes be made retroactive so that it can actually reach back and help those that you use as an example to change whatever it was that you changed. I never understood that. Sometimes I use an analogy that people don't like me to use, and I don't know if I should share it today or not, but I might better pass on it. But it's just, yeah, but it just says that it doesn't make logical sense. If you say something needs to be changed, and then you do everything under the sun to see that it is changed, and then when it is changed, it's great, because that means that practice will no longer be done. But to not reach back and let it benefit the people that you use to show how wrong it was, to me, doesn't make logical sense. But anyway, I was out for nearly 2 years doing everything that a productive member of society would do, and then it was time for me to turn myself back in May 14. But before then, an NPR reporter heard about my story and actually did a broadcast on it, and it caught national media attention. And in doing so, they was able to see during my period of incarceration for those 21 and a half years that I had done so without any disciplinary infractions. They was also able to see that I had taken over, as the president stated in the State of the Union, over 30 Bible correspondence courses. But I wasn't counting them because, as I stated, there was no form of rehabilitation in federal prison when I was serving the time. It was only about incapacitation. I mean, you take a particular person off the street for a particular period of time, and then once that time is served, you place them back out in society, whether he's changed or not. So once I was actually released, and they was able to see throughout my period of incarceration that I had taken all these courses, that I had done all these things to mentor other inmates, they still locked up, A lot of people don't like to use the word inmates. But anyway, I had done a lot of things to, help my fellow brothers that were locked up with me. And in doing so, they was also able to see that I had done so without any disciplinary infractions. Then they was able to look at the 2-year period while I was released and how I had done everything that you would want a productive member of society to do. So therefore, my situation caught national media attention. And a professor named Sean Hotwood, who's a Georgetown professor, contacted my attorneys, Ms. Mariah Wooten and Mr. Michael Holly, and told them to contact me because I had turned myself back in to serve the remaining 10 years of that sentence. And once I contacted him, he said he wanted to take my case pro bono and present it to the president as well as to on Capitol Hill, because there's a bill called the First Step Act that's going to try to introduce rehabilitation into the federal prison system, and they need to hear your story, they need to hear your situation. And in doing so, he was also hoping that I receive a commutation of sentence from the president. So therefore, he did so, and throughout that course, the First Step Act actually passed and was signed by the president December 18th, and then my attorneys, Ms. Mariah Wooten and Mr. Michael Holly, said, well, wait a minute, we don't need a commutation of sentence because now that this First Step Act made retroactive the 2010 changes, we'll just petition the court, since we're already before the court, appealing his return back to prison, and ask the judge to allow the First Step Act to be able to benefit Mr. Charles. And in doing so it was. I received notification on January the 1st, which was New Year's Day, and most of the judges here as well as probation officers know that nothing happens on holidays, let alone New Year's Day. But I received the actual motion from the courts on January 1st, showing that my attorneys had filed it. And on January 3rd, everybody also know nothing happens that fast. On January 3rd, I was being called up and told that I was going to be released that evening because the judge had granted immediate release. Okay, thank you. Since then, like I said, was invited to be a guest at the State of the Union. I was also invited to be, or hired to be, a criminal justice reform fellow for FAMM, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, to go around the United States speaking to state legislators and governors about the criminal justice system and how it needs to be changed. The only sad part about this whole thing that took place, because as I stated earlier before I shared, the abuses that I or my family members or my mother suffered, was I take accountability for my own actions. And I always did and still do. I always did, but more so once I got to the situation where I was being told that I had to return to prison for that remainder 10 years. Judge Trauger gave the prosecution an opportunity to have an out by allowing my rehabilitative efforts, which had taken place throughout my period of incarceration, as well as the 2-year period that I was out, to be taken into accountability and weighed over my return to prison, and they declined to do so. As a matter of fact, they wrote up this paper stating why I needed to be returned back to prison, not even bruising or touching any of the things that were filed in the petition by my attorneys on why I should not. So therefore, my whole thing was, okay, so you know that there was a racial disparity attached to the drug type that I was incarcerated for, so much so that it allowed me to have anywhere from a 12 to 15-year sentence less. That's how much of a disparity it was. Also, because of rehabilitation, I took it upon myself to learn as much as I can and better myself and opportunities for myself by taking all the programs that were available for me. So therefore, rehabilitation, you're saying that that doesn't even matter. And then the fact that restorative justice means I return to my community, and I don't necessarily looking at it so much as just like paying back, although I feel that I'm obligated to society for giving me the second chance and the opportunity, again, to be among it, to do my best while I'm in it. But the fact that restorative justice not only restores me back to the people that I wronged, since I didn't have any, well, I mean, I don't want to say that I sold drugs, so there may be some individuals that are harmed, but my harm was mainly done on the community itself. So therefore, restorative justice restored me back to the community. And as I stated, I was volunteering my time and services. I was working, I was being a productive member of society, paying my taxes and doing everything that you would want somebody to do. So therefore, because none of those things, the racial disparity that was attached to the drug type, the fact that I had been rehabilitated, and it was clearly documented by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, as well as you was able to see what I had done during the 2-year period that I was released. And restorative justice meant that I didn't have a life sentence or a death sentence, so one day I was going to be returned back to society. And as many have spoken earlier here, over these past couple of days, 95% of the people are going to be returning back to society. And so once they return back to society, you want them rehabilitated and better as opposed to being the same. So therefore, I couldn't understand why the prosecution didn't grant, even though they had filed the initial appeal, for me to remain out after weighing those situations. But it allowed me to see that it was more about punitiveness. It was more about, I don't want to say vindictiveness, because by the law he was correct. It wasn't made retroactive, so therefore he could challenge my release. But because I thought that it should always be about rehabilitation as opposed to incapacitation, just like the Aleph video that they showed earlier today, where the rabbi has spoken about once a person goes in, and they use the word undesirable actions, I use the criminal action, it's so that they can reflect on their undesirable actions, be rehabilitated, and come back out a better person. So therefore, I believe that is most fitting, and of course it is, for it, because that's the whole thing that I believe that imprisonment should be about. If a person doesn't have a life sentence or a death sentence, they're going to be returned to society. And you'll want that person returned to society to be rehabilitated. And I ran into some barriers. I ran into a few barriers with I ran into a few barriers as I re-entered society with housing and employment. But I'll just leave that alone, as Cori has stated. Time for questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We're going to take some questions.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your very difficult but important for us to hear experiences. I am currently a federal prosecutor prosecuting cases, but had the privilege to spend 2016 really doing God's work in the pardon office on the clemency initiative. And as you may know, 1,715 people were released. Thousands of people like yourself, Mr. Charles, were left behind. So I'm so happy that First Step gave you a chance. But my question is, did you know people when you were incarcerated who did benefit or attempted to benefit from the clemency initiative? And did you have any particular view?
Yes, I did. I think you're talking about from not only the Fairness and Sentencing Act of 2010, but also the clemency project that was done by the president as well for the commutation of certain people. Yes, I've known several people who received a reduction in sentence or the commutation from the presidency. If I'm not mistaken, it was, I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but it was tens and tens of thousands that had filed and didn't receive it. And if I'm not mistaken, it was under 5,000 that did. So therefore, I knew many people that actually filed for that had crack cocaine sentences that hoped for a commutation of sentence. And I did see some of them released, and I did see a lot of them still remain with their life sentences or 30 years and greater sentences. Yes, ma'am.
And to that also, there are many people who, that I know who receive, actually, let me talk about women specifically. There are only a few women that I know that actually received commutation of sentence on CP-14 because there weren't a lot of women who actually were released, unfortunately, under that. There are women still sitting in prison, like Michelle West and Sandra Rucker, and who've been in almost 30 years. Yeah. Do I feel, yes, that the president have given Alice Marie Johnson a chance through clemency? I'm talking about President Trump right now. But do I feel that we should really look at restructuring the law? Rewriting the law from those wrongs? Absolutely. Like, we could re-implement federal parole. We could take away life without the possibility of parole in the federal system, where most of the people who were in would be coming home. So, I mean, you know, if you have the ability to do what you've done on the pardon side, then I think like the next step would really be looking at how do more judges and prosecutors actually come together to look at retroactivity and or rewriting laws that are more just.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hello. I want to commend the panel, and I do have a question, but I also have worked with Topeka in the past, and she is a leader in this movement. I'm also a formerly incarcerated person, and I thank the Aleph Institute for inviting me. I also will be at the table selling copies of my book. And I was late not coming yesterday because, as Ben stated earlier today, I was speaking to young students about my story and how I got in the system to prevent young people from going in at a university in Charlotte. But my question, and you know, when I was incarcerated, President Clinton commuted my sentence in December 2000, and my parents were like you, speaking about my situation. My son, who I gave birth to while I was incarcerated, he's actually living in New York now, but I didn't realize later the pain that, even though he was raised in a healthy environment, the pain that my incarceration still has with him today. But my question is related to Topeka. When we're talking about rewriting the sentence, and you know, you were released, but I would imagine you and Matthew, I know you were released recently, let off probation, but even after coming out and being so successful, if you could talk about your experience with being on probation, because even after my commutation, I was on probation as well for 5 years.
Absolutely. So, thank you, Kimba. And
Yeah.
Kimba, I remember, if anybody else knows Kimba Smith, Poster Child is her book, so please get it. It's an incredible story.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, when I came home, well, let me start when I talked about the first time I was arrested and I was given federal supervision. And I did not, I wasn't given any resources then either, but I had knowledge. I knew where I was going, what I wanted to do. My probation officer they put me under what they call like minimum supervision. So if I wanted to travel, he approved everything. He wrote a paragraph for me to get off of supervision. The judge agreed and they let me off. That was the first time. When I came home in 2015, after being in the halfway house 6 months and then going on federal supervision, I had one probation officer who was incredible. I told her everything that I wanted to do, because there's a stipulation on conditions of release that say people with convictions can't communicate or fraternize with each other. So I told her about the organization I was starting. She gave me permission. She approved every travel request. I would just email her. And then she became pregnant, was transferring to another office, and put me with another probation officer who she said she felt would be really helpful to the mission and the vision of the work I was doing. So maybe a month after, I began to get a bunch of problems. You know, they would call me in the office every other week, give me random drug tests when, in fact, it wasn't even on my J&C. Actually, the judge had wrote that I didn't need them. But they still would call me in to have them. She would pop up at my parents' house and would say things like, oh, well, who bought this piano, Topeka? I mean, like as if my parents did work hard, they couldn't afford to buy a baby grand piano, but that it had to come from some type of drug money. Like, it was just very intrusive, and to the point where I was understanding the law, and I would tell my parents, if I'm not here, don't let them in. They can only come into the room that I'm in. They cannot just walk over the house, you know, and do those things. And so I began to have to fight because they stopped all of my travel and told me I had to go to the judge. So I started having to write the judge, asking the judge for permission to travel. And the judge would give it to me every time, and then leave it up to the discretion of federal supervision. So they would say, okay, you can travel 3 times, and then you have to go back to the judge. Now, sometimes I'm traveling 3 times in 1 week. So it was like this cycle back and forth. And so I put in a request for early termination of sentence after the first year, and much like you were talking about, they didn't talk about any of my accomplishments. They said I was not extraordinary, and my lawyer's like, well, if she's not, then who is? But they denied it without prejudice. The judge told me to come back in a year. So I filed again, and the judge actually he took me off of federal supervision in February of last year, citing that me being under supervision actually impeded the work that I was doing, because with Hope House, they weren't letting women who were under state supervision on parole live there. They were trying to pull them out and actually violate them and send them back to prison because I was under federal supervision and because I was basically the owner, that they said we couldn't fraternize. I mean, it was really ridiculous, but they did it. The judge released me, and also Vinay just got released earlier this year too, so, yeah.
Thank you. So lots of struggles, a mountain to still climb, but thank you all so much for your advocacy and for your willingness to share. Thank you all.
Thank you. Just a reminder.